to your wheels. And I'm going to show you how you can do that by the way of gear ratios. And if you don't know what gear ratios are, well, you're in luck, because today I'm going to over-explain it. So for this explanation, we'll start all the way at our engine. So as the air-fuel mixture is being ignited inside our combustion chambers, it forces our pistons to go down. And in turn, those pistons, which are connected to our crankshaft by way of connecting rods, will turn our crankshaft. And that twisting force, which results from the twisting of the crankshaft, is our engine torque. Now, in order to get that torque from our engine to our wheels, what comes next is a manual transmission. Now, in order to connect the crankshaft of your engine to the input shaft of your transmission, there's a clutch assembly that's used. And your clutch setup consists of a clutch disc, a pressure plate, and a manual transmission flywheel with a friction surface. Now, we're not going to get into how a clutch system works in this video. I have a separate video for that, and I'll put a link to that at the end of this video if you're interested. But in so many words, your clutch system is there to allow you to engage and disengage your engine from your transmission. In other words, allow you to transfer torque from your engine into your transmission. And the job of your manual transmission or gearbox is to take in the torque that's coming from your engine through its input shaft and change it to whatever you deem necessary for your driving conditions and send it out the output shaft of your transmission. And again, your transmission does this by the way of changing different gears, or in other words, gear ratios. So with that said, we'll start at our input shaft into our transmission housing. So as you can see, inside our transmission housing, our input shaft is connected to our input shaft gear. Actually, let's call this our driver gear, as it's connected directly to the input shaft, and it runs at the same RPM as our input shaft. Alright, so from there, power travels through our driver gear down to this gear, which is connected or attached to our counter shaft. Alright, so let's say we want to put our transmission into first gear and get going from a dead stop. So we would step on the clutch pedal, disengaging our crankshaft from our input shaft, which slows it down, but furthermore removes the torque from our engine from our input shaft. And then from there, with the help of our synchronizers that are on this output shaft here, we can line up the gears from this first gear that you see here with the hub that's connected to this output shaft. And when we line that up and then remove our foot from the clutch, we again engage our crankshaft with our input shaft and transfer torque all the way from here down to this gear and up to first gear and out the output shaft. Now you'll probably notice that this first gear is a lot bigger. There are our driver shaft and our second gear. Now that's because when you're trying to get going from a dead stop, that's when you need the most amount of torque. So if you line up this smaller gear or driver gear to this larger gear, let's call this the driven gear, you can produce a lot more torque by turning this to our output shaft. Now the trade-off is that it takes more revolutions for this smaller gear to turn this first gear 1 revolution. So here's an example that will help you understand. Let's say we want to take off this axle nut. Now we could use this wrench, and let's say this wrench is only a foot long. Now let's assume I haven't had breakfast for today, and the maximum amount of torque or pressure I can apply at the end of this wrench is 30 pounds. Now more than likely I'm not going to be able to twist off that axle nut, so therefore what I can do is go grab a much longer wrench or a longer pipe and put it over this wrench, and then apply the same amount of pressure, or the 30 pounds, at the end of that longer pipe or wrench, therefore creating more torque and twisting that axle nut off. Now from that example, we can simply replace me, or rather the force that I'm applying at the end of that wrench, with the driver gear, and then you can replace the different size gears inside your transmission with the different size wrenches that you could use to twist off that axle nut. However, due to the different sizes between the driver gear and the other driven gears, or in this case, let's say our first gear, it takes more revolutions for this driver gear to turn this first gear just 1 revolution. And as you probably guessed, that difference is your gear ratios. So for example, on this first gear, it would take our driver gear, or rather our input shaft gear, 3.307 revolutions to turn this first gear 1 revolution. Or for the sake of our second gear, it would be 1.809 revolutions of this driver gear to turn this 1 revolution. For the third gear, it would be 1.23. And for the fourth gear, it would be 0.85. And generally speaking, your last gear, or the gears that require less than 1 revolution of the driver gear to turn 1 revolution, are considered your overdrive gears. Alright, not so fast. We're still not done with our gearing. So what I explained above was still up to this point. So we had our input shaft coming into our manual transmission. We had the gears inside here, and then here's our output shaft. But On a, let's say a rear wheel drive, from here you're connected to your drive shaft, and from there you connect it to your rear differential. And on a rear wheel drive vehicle with a differential in the rear, you have your pinion gear and your ring gear, and those have a gear ratio of their own. Now I don't know, let's just throw out a number, let's say 4.06. And what that means is that for every 4.06 revolutions of this drive shaft into this differential, the output shafts of the differential, or let's say the rear axles from your rear differential, will turn 1 revolution. All right, so as you can see, there's a lot of gearing involved between your crankshaft, or rather your engine, and your wheels, and that's because this is the most efficient way to make the most efficient use out of the power that's coming from your engine. If you only use larger gears, you know, you're gonna have a really high RPM if you want to drive at, you know, highway speeds, and that's obviously if your engine allows for those really high RPMs, which will create a lot of noise and also you know, use up a lot of gas. But if you have an ability to change gear ratios, you know, you can use those really larger gears for when you need a lot of torque, like from going from a dead stop, and then once you get going and get to those highway speed or cruising speeds, you can, you know, use a much smaller gear. Just think of a bicycle with gears, and if you're old enough and remember, think of a bicycle without gears. Enough said. Now, as you probably guessed, if you want to get more torque, what you can do is to replace your gears inside the transmission or your final drive gear. Now, generally speaking, if you have a front wheel drive or an all-wheel drive, you're gonna have a really hard time either digging into that transmission and replacing just the gears or your final drive gears, because, you know, it's just not worth opening those transmissions up, you know, locating or sourcing one of these gears, putting it back together, putting it back in the car. It's just going to cost a lot of money and too much work, and it's not going to be worth the outcome unless you have a high performance vehicle again, and you know, that's a story on its own. However, if you have a rear wheel drive vehicle, what you can do is to replace your final gears, which are going to be in your differential in the back. So you get those, you know, you get a bigger gears, you get this number higher, and what that results is you get more torque at your wheels. But what you want to pay attention to is that you're doing this on a car that is capable of revving higher than, you know, your average vehicle out there, because, you know, if your car is not, you know, your red line is kind of low, you can't really rev it that high, what's going to happen is you're going to get more torque, but then you're trying to go cruising on the freeway, trying to go 80 miles an hour or something, then you're revving at, you know, 35, 4,000 RPMs or something ridiculous like that. It's just not going to be pleasant. Alright, hope you enjoyed this video. Till next time, you can check my other videos, of which I put links to on this side of the screen, and again, links down below in the description box as well. Alright, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys soon.